10 teams, 20 drivers. It's the 75th anniversary of Formula One. It's the 2025 season. This is Off the Grid on rightradio.ca. I'm your host, Evan Halbert, and it's been a while. We haven't been here for a while. So we're talking about Formula One if you haven't tuned in before. It's going to be super fun, really enjoyable. I'm going to be recapping a good chunk of pretty much the last little while. It's been crazy in the Formula One world for the last little bit. Super exciting. The field has never been closer. And honestly, this is probably the perfect end to this season of regulations before we get into the 2026 season. So let's get started. As I mentioned earlier, is the Formula One 75th anniversary, which is also being coined as F175. We've had tons of really cool stuff. We had an event at the O2, which was hosted by Jack Whitehall, and he proceeded to roast everybody, which was fantastic. We also got to see a lot of the cars as to what they looked like. We had performances by Take That, Caden Brown, Machine Gun Kelly, featuring Bring Me Horizon, and that was really cool. Overall, good show. I don't really know if the drivers particularly cared for it. Maybe some did. Maybe some others didn't. But that is what it is. The most important thing is this was our first look at the cars and our first look at new drivers at new teams. So the driver lineup has changed dramatically. We have 5 new rookies. We have a bunch of teams that are in brand new colors, and that is crazy to think about, considering last season, nobody changed. We had no changes in between the seasons. It was only afterwards that we had some changes. So just to recap, Nico Hülkenberg has gone from Haas to Sauber. Esteban Ocon has gone from Alpine to Haas. Lewis Hamilton, the big one, has moved from Mercedes to Ferrari. Liam Lawson is to Red Bull. Don't worry, we'll talk about that later today because that's a development already. Carlos Sainz has moved over to Williams. Gabriel Bortoleto is one of our rookies this season. He's joining Sauber. Ollie Behrman, who did 3 races last season, is now on his way to Haas. Isaac Hadjar is now at Racing Bulls. He was the runner-up in F2, so he's made his F1 debut with the Racing Bulls. Jack Doohan has made his way to Alpine. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. And Kimi Antonelli, the prodigal son, has made his way over to Mercedes, which is going to be very interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So that's been all the big changes that have been shuffling around at the beginning of the season. And we got into testing to see where everyone was. Every car did their own little shakedown. We'll talk about each team individually, how they looked going into the season, and then we'll review the first 2 races loosely because there are reviews out there. Okay, let's talk about Sauber. First up, they were looking decent, or they're looking better than last year, which honestly is not that much of a leap. They're still definitely at the back of the field, and I think they're kind of just holding on until they move over to Audi. So their lineup is Nico Hülkenberg and Gabriel Bortoleto. Gabriel Bortoleto won the F2 championship last year, earning his spot in the Formula One. It seems like their pit stops are looking better. That's saying something, I guess. We'll see what happens later on. I know that Nico Hülkenberg scored points in Australia, which is more points than Sauber learned last year throughout the entire season. So that's a cool stat. We'll move on to Williams really quick. Williams are looking fantastic. Absolutely amazing. They have an outstanding driver lineup with Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon. And honestly, it's going to be pretty good. James Vowles did a really good job securing Carlos Sainz last year in contract negotiations. So that's been really good. They're looking to be at the sharp end of the midfield right now, kind of like the best of the rest situation. And that's really exciting to see. If I had one wish for this year, it is that Williams moves their way back up to the front. They start getting more sponsorships. They actually have a new sponsorship, which is Atlassian. They're their new title sponsor. And the car looks fantastic, I will say. I think it's one of my favorite liveries of the new season. You can't see it on this image, but closer to it's where the halo is and where the kind of side pods juts out. There are little tags that indicate which driver it is. So it'll say Sainz or it'll say Albon based off who it is. And I think that's a small but really nice touch to it. So hopefully the funding that comes in from Atlassian helps Williams with their development, and also helps so that they don't have to be replacing parts. Last year they had Logan Sargent. They replaced it with Franco Colapinto, and at that point in time, the car was so damaged that by the end of the season, they were scrounging for parts. They had almost mismatched. It's almost like if you were getting dressed and you put on the wrong socks, the wrong shoes, a different t-shirt, and different pants. It was a mismatch of just whatever you had in your wardrobe to make the car complete the season. Okay, on to Racing Bulls. Now, Racing Bulls have also changed their name. So they were known as Visa Cash App RB last year, which is the worst name ever. So they've gone to be like, look, definitively our branding is Racing Bulls. Now, while that is better than last year, it is still not amazing. It's pretty terrible. The only thing that's not really terrible about this is the driver lineup and their livery. This is without question the best livery on the grid. It looks fantastic. I like the white with the blue. It just looks so good. Now, going into this, I thought that, at least in testing, Racing Bulls did not look good. Not even a little bit. So the fact that they're starting to perform really well is fantastic. And honestly, I had no love for Isaac Ajar going into this season. But seeing him perform and do well has been really great. Yuki Tsunoda has been now the leader of the team for a number of years, which has been really exciting. And once again, we're going to talk about the Liam Yuki situation a little later on. But at this moment in time, we're just talking about them as if they were a part of this team. So Racing Bulls are looking pretty good. And honestly, I think without team intervention, they would probably be at the head of the midfield. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. China has been the biggest offender in terms of the Racing Bulls progression in terms of points. Okay, let's talk about Haas. The All-American team, there we go. The Haas livery looks okay. I think it's kind of following the idea of it ain't broke, don't fix it. Taking a page from Red Bull, if you will, in the sense that their livery has not changed for many, many years. Their new driver lineup is looking to be Esteban Ocon and Oliver Behrman. This is another full driver swap. Last year, it was Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg. So taking a chance on another rookie is interesting and sometimes can be really spooky. But I think a lot of teams are kind of taking that chance of, we're going to take a rookie, put him in the car, and hopefully they just don't crash and maybe they score points. I think that's a good gamble to take on Oliver Behrman. He's doing fantastic. He did really well in F2. He did really well in F3. So seeing him start to perform in F1 has been fantastic. We'll take Australia out of the key equation with Oliver Behrman, but China is where he really came into his own. Okay, we'll move on to Alpine, or Alpine if you are in North America. They are Alpine, though. The only French team on the grid, and their livery is looking pretty good. By comparison to last year was such a weird year for car colors. Most of the time, they were just like, let's just do a little bit of color and then black, and that's it. So the fact that they've gone back to the roots of the pink and blue has been fantastic. And I believe halfway through the season, they're going to swap the colors to be predominantly pink and blue for their title sponsor, BWT. So that's been really exciting. They also have a new driver who is Jack Doohan. Now, Jack has had a lot of, I guess you could say he's had a lot of criticisms come his way. There's no expectation for him to do well. And a lot of people are saying the reason why Alpine decided they were going to sign Franco Colapinto as their reserve was specifically to say, look, Jack, perform or you're replaced, and this is your replacement. I don't know if that's really the best way to do it, but I'm not team principal, so it's not my call. Now, Jack has been doing quite well, and we'll talk about that as we review the races. Aston Martin's one of the few teams that have retained their driver lineup with Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso. Lance Stroll, he's not going anywhere. Not at all. They did a really weird thing last year where they decided that they were going to put him on a contract for a 2-year renewal. So guaranteed they kept him for 2 years, but we've always known Lance to be on a rolling contract where it just kind of, he stays for as long as, Lawrence is funding the team. In terms of car performance, they're looking decent. And that's the thing. I'm going to be saying that a lot for a lot of these teams because the pack is so close. I think every team has a possibility of scoring points. So it's just a matter of who's made bigger strides than others I think everyone has made a step forward. It's just a matter of how much. Fernando Alonso has been saying good things about the car, and that's always a good sign. You always want your world champions to be saying good things when they're driving the car. So much so that he told media that he wasn't going to comment on car performance because there's nothing for him to tell them that they don't already know. Or that it was a waste of time for them to be talking about it. Okay, we'll talk on to the top 4, which is Mercedes. Mercedes are looking... A lot of people are saying that the car doesn't look that great. Honestly, I don't mind the combination of the silver arrow versus the black with the teal in the middle. I think it looks pretty good. In terms of overall performance, they had to do the very difficult decision of replacing Lewis Hamilton this year. And they decided to go with 18-year-old Kimi Antonelli. And he's been scouted by Toto and the rest of the crew for a while now. And they've been saying this is the next Schumacher. This is the next Senna. This is the next Verstappen, next Hamilton. So we'll see what happens. We saw Kimi last year in a test period where he borrowed George's car for an FP1 in Monza and proceeded to shunt it to the wall. We haven't actually seen anything like that this year. He's been doing extremely well. This also promotes George to being the number 1. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the Mercedes pairing in a little bit and why being the number 1 for George right now may not be the best idea or may not be very beneficial for him. But we'll talk about that in a bit. All right, moving on. We're talking about the Red Bulls. So this is what I mean when I say the Red Bull is following the "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" kind of idea with their livery. This is also going to be the last year where they're kind of appeasing Honda. 2026 is when they're going to be moving on to their partnership with Ford, and that'll be really interesting. We've also seen that Red Bull had probably the hardest testing period. They didn't really get a lot accomplished from what we could see. The car looked really difficult to drive, and they were swapping out parts for all 3 days. They actually went into Australia with 12 new parts, and I'm not smart enough to understand what kind of difference that makes on the car, what kind of performance addition or disadvantage that it gives them. All I know is that is a lot of the car that you were replacing up and down in order to make it work. Now, when you have a driver that is Max Verstappen, you just do well. You perform. You outperform the car in any capacity. The tricky part is that second Red Bull seat, which at the time that I wrote this script was Liam Lawson. So we'll talk about it afterwards with that change. But overall, they're definitely on the back foot going into this beginning of the season. Onto the Ferraris. So they're looking to be a little behind by comparison to the Mercedes and McLarens. If it was a tough top 3 in terms of car performance, it would probably be Ferrari, Mercedes, and then McLaren at the number 1. But that's a tease for McLaren later on. They also have a new addition of Lewis Hamilton added to theirs, a 7-time world champion, which is fantastic, along with the golden boy, Charles Leclerc. Overall, I think this is probably the best driver lineup in terms of overall experience, performance, and generally just doing well. The only thing that could really hold back this team is the car and the pit wall. So it's really interesting to see how this will go. My vote is that if Red Bull isn't winning it, I would like Ferrari to win it. If McLaren's running away with it, I would like Oscar to win it. That is my 2 cents. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about McLaren. McLaren are without question the favorites to win everything this year. They are looking very competitive, very strong. We're probably going to see a few races where conditions are perfect for McLaren. They will be running away with 15, 20-second leads. And it'll probably be a title fight between Oscar and Lando. McLaren's one of the other teams that hasn't changed their driver lineup, and why would you? Oscar Piastri is doing fantastic, and Lando Norris is so comfortable with the team. He is the number 1 on this team, even though Zach Brown will not tell you that. Zach Brown has the idea that there is no number 1 in their team. They are going to favor both drivers equally, and we saw how that played out last year. Lando had an opportunity to do well and win the championship last year, but he wasn't prioritized when it mattered and when it was needed. So we'll see how that happens. So those are our 10 teams. Now, there is an 11th team that is coming in next year in 2026. That is Cadillac. And we don't know too much about Cadillac, but they were approved for the next season, and that's super exciting. Now, who the driver lineup could be for Cadillac, that is up to debate. Whether That is Sergio Perez, which has been a name been throwing around. They may want an American. They may want, I dare say, Logan Sargent. I seriously doubt it, though. We don't want someone who's crashing the car regularly. They may grab someone from IndyCar. Hard to say. But that will be coming in next year. Okay, let's go into the review of our races. I don't have too many images about these. I actually don't have any images on these, simply because if you watch the races, you would understand why it was so interesting and why it was so good. Australia is the first time it's the first time we've kicked off with Australia since, I want to say 2019. That sounds about right. The race itself was absolute chaos. We had 2 days of dry practice and dry qualifying, and only to get a completely rained out race day, which is fantastic or not fantastic, depending on who you are. So just a quick breakdown. Isaac Jar was out on the formation lap. He went to turn 2, lost control of the car, and just spun it right out. Then we had to wait a little bit in order to get that all cleaned up and ready to go. Once we actually got the race started, we had Max move up into second position ahead of Oscar Piastri, only for Jack Doohan and Carlos Sainz to crash out on the following lap. If you're keeping track, that is 3 different cars that went out within the first 2 races, or within the first 2 laps, technically. Tons of other stuff happened once we got on the restart. We kind of had about 7-8 laps of kind of nothing. Kimi Antonelli had a spin at some point, but he recovered very well, only losing 1 position. Up closer to the front, Verstappen is still in second place, but he goes wide at one of the turns, and allowing for Oscar to fight for the lead. And for a while, it was a question mark of, so who's got it? Who's going to win? It's Oscar's home race, and then it's Lando leading the race. And it looked like Oscar was starting to catch Lando. It was starting to look really good. It was starting to look like we were going to have a true fight between the 2 drivers at McLaren, until we heard over the radio, maintain position until after the back markers, which I was infuriated to hear. I don't like team orders, especially when it's the first race. Nobody has points. Nobody has done anything. We are literally just trying to figure out, we're trying to figure out who's going to be doing better. And if it comes down to it, team orders later on in the season, it's going to be massive. I was furious because Oscar was catching him. And go figure, when they said, maybe 2 laps later, when they said, hey, you're free to fight, Oscar was already down 2.5 seconds. So completely threw off his groove. And I honestly think that if that didn't happen, Oscar would have been leading the race and he might have won. Okay, so Fernando Alonso ended up crashing out, which is very, very, very unrealistic and very, very difficult to understand, because Fernando Alonso, he's the most experienced driver on the grid, and if anything, it showcases how wet the race was. For him to crash out during the race was a surprise, without question. Now, we get on to lap 42, 43-ish, and we get the safety car restart. And then we're being told that there is more rain on the way. 3 laps later, chaos ensues. Both the McLarens go off in the wet. Lando immediately panics, and his team calls him in to switch to the inters. And Oscar gets beached on the grass, which is unheard of, and it's not someplace you want to be. Max ends up staying out in order to keep going, and he is effectively leading the race at this point. It is very difficult to understand where it is that we're going, and this was a really crazy, chaotic race to get going. After 2 laps, Max pits, and then suddenly we have Lewis Hamilton in Ferrari leading the race on debut, which is so exciting and incredibly enjoyable in order to watch. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't stick around, because getting onto the inters straight away was the right call for Lando, and he ends up retaking the lead, and Max retains his second place after 2 laps of fumbling around the lap of the track in order to go in for inters. Soon after that, we do get Gabriel Bortoleto and Liam Lawson crashing out almost at the same time, but on different parts of the track. We get a safety car, and then we have 5 laps of Max chasing Lando. And it got close. It got really close. We got within 0.3 of a second, but unfortunately, it just didn't quite work out. Lando ended up winning the race. Oscar finished P9 after an amazing recovery and unbeaching himself onto the grass. Max Verstappen came in second, and George Russell came in third to round out the podium. Honestly, what a race. What an amazing race to start off. It was so exciting. It was a big question mark of who's going to win, who's not going to win, what's going to happen, who's going to crash. I had lots of question marks at 4 a.m. while I was watching this race. Okay, to recap, in terms of our DNFs, we had Isaac Hadjar, Jack Doohan, Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, Gabriel Bortoleto, and Liam Lawson. Now, there's a lot of question marks as to whether Liam Lawson counts as a rookie. He's done 11 races, so I don't believe he counts. So that means that we have 3 of our 5 rookies who crashed out in Australia, and then Carlos Sainz with a torque issue in order to spin out, and Fernando Alonso, unfortunately, just got caught out. Wow. And that was Australia. Australia was an excellent opener, and a week later, we got to go to China. China was the second race, and by comparison to Australia, it wasn't really nearly as interesting. We had lots going on in terms of a lot of the hype build-up. Lando's leading the championship, and it's also the first time that someone other than Max Verstappen was leading the championship in a number of years, since 2022, I believe. So, we'll talk about China really quick, and then we'll talk about some other stuff. So, Fernando Alonso retires and is currently last in the championship after 2 races. Crashed out in Australia, and then he retired after a few laps in China, which is surprising and a little disappointing, the fact that he is now currently last in the standings. We actually got some racing, even though that means we had 20 laps of kind of the same cars rolling around, and that's just because tire management and fuel management. Mercedes came out, and they were doing very well during the race. George was very strong. Kimi was very strong during the race, and that was exciting to see. Oliver Behrman was showing us as to why he belongs in Formula One. Incredibly strong, very fun, and honestly is super great. We'll talk more about radio messages later on, as Oliver Behrman was talking about. I don't know, he's getting a little sassy on the radio. Racing Bulls have been doing really well, and this was also the first day of our sprint race. Lewis Hamilton won the sprint. He started on sprint pole, and that was fantastic. Very enjoyable. Unfortunately, it didn't translate into the race, but we'll talk about that in a moment. We've also learned that Racing Bulls are very good so long as the pit wall doesn't do anything or no strategy is involved. Yuki Tsunoda and Isaac Hadjar were very strong in the race until it came to pit stops and strategy, in which case they found themselves outside of the points. But it was redemption day for a horrible home race in Australia for Oscar Piastri. He came back and he ended up winning the Chinese Grand Prix. And that was super exciting. He had a little scream in his helmet. For someone who does not emote, if you know and you've seen Oscar, he does not really emote. He doesn't really showcase his emotions that often. So the fact that he got a little excited is very good and very exciting. Lando comes home second after having a almost near brake failure closer to the end of the race. He said for several laps that the brake pedal was feeling like it was going longer and longer and longer. And that means normally when you press the brakes on a Formula One car, it kind of just stays. It doesn't really go anywhere. So to feel it go longer and longer and longer and longer and longer to the point where you're basically pressing it on the floor is a scary idea and a scary thought. Because that doesn't happen in Formula One cars. It's not quite like road cars. And he even said himself, one more lap and he probably would have been in the wall just because of sheer brake pressure and brake failure. But lucky for him and lucky for George, or unlucky for George, that didn't end up happening. George Russell ended up third for his second third place in the 2025 season. Overall did very, very well. The race itself was kind of a snooze fest. Not really too much that was happening. I thought that certain points were interesting. We also got to see Liam Lawson try to trudge his way around in order for nothing to happen. Oliver Behrman started to do really well, and he started passing cars left, right, and center, and that was really exciting to see in a Haas. So this is what I mean when I say that the teams are extremely close together with each other, which means that we are starting to get to the point where anyone can win a race, provided the conditions are right, but everyone can get points, and that's exciting. Okay, so that has been a review of the last 2 races. I kept it a little shorter, and there's not super much in depth just because we don't have too much time to talk about those. But I will talk about, we have a new segment going on here where we're going to be talking about the different radio messages that are popping up throughout the race. So we have 2 races to comb through. I chose my 5 favorite that I went through in no particular order. So we'll go with Oliver Behrman in China. It's talking about Chow. If you're unfamiliar with Chow, Oliver Behrman, whenever he was passing someone, I believe he passed Liam Lawson and one of the Saubers, and all we heard from him was Chow, which means goodbye. And that, a little bit of sassy, he said in an interview afterwards that he felt bad about it afterwards. But honestly, if you're doing well, why would you feel bad? It's pretty good. Okay, next up we have Alex Albon. Now, I wanted to actually grab the audio for this because you can hear in Alex's voice as he's saying this that everyone needs to chill out. Funny enough, while he's driving at 200 kilometers per hour. But his race engineer says, hey, we're happy with tires for now. And Alex cuts him off and he says, I am good. I am better than everyone. Let's relax. I am very comfortable. This is probably the most animated we've seen Alex when he's not complaining about another driver. And he was right. He did really well. Alex was doing extremely well. Our resident tire whisperer was fantastic. Next up, we have Yuki Tsunoda. This was also in China. It's like, I want to use more front. Well, we don't want to. Well, I want to. Okay, well, do whatever you need to. So just a cheeky little back and forth. Yuki expressing, look, I need to use more of the front in order to make this work. And it doesn't really matter what you say. Okay, we have Charles up next. Charles has been sassy lately, coming in from the front of, or the beginning of 2025 season. This was during Australia, and he was asking if there was a leakage of what? That the seat was full of water, like full of water. His radio engineer proceeded to say, it must be the water. Let's add that to the words of wisdom. There's another one I didn't add here, which is Charles Leclerc saying, nope. And that was during China. He was asked to use less curb in order to preserve tire life, and his response was just, nope. Very good. There's a funny image. I actually didn't end up grabbing it. It's on Instagram, of the Ferrari words of wisdom on a podium with a little book, and I think that is hilarious. Okay, the final one is from Lewis Hamilton. Now, Ferrari have been very communicative over the last 2 races, and I'm hoping to see a little more of it in Suzuka. Obviously, Lewis, he's still learning the car, and he described that learning the car has been very challenging for him and very difficult. So his race engineer is saying to use K1 when you're close, and Lewis is very politely asking him to leave it to him. His race engineer saying K1 is available, Lewis getting a little more insistive of, yes, I know, leave it to me, please. Which is great to hear that Lewis is getting along fairly well with his race engineer. Now, in order to remind you of this really quick, the race engineers, or if in Ferrari, they predominantly speak Italian and English is their second language. So they may not understand what is currently being said. Then I'll add this to the words of wisdom comment as well. What his engineer probably meant was, oh, it might be the drinking water in the car that is leaking. So, but like, as far as you're concerned, it's like, it's just the water. The only reason that makes this funny is because it's, 1, it was raining, 2, he already described it as water. So yeah. The Ferrari engineers not speaking English as a first language, I understand. We got to give them a little bit of grain of salt. It does make it for very entertaining radio communications. Okay. We still have some big news before we move on. And that is the Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda swap. This came out earlier this week. Early last week? Man, my weeks are blurring together. May have been last week. But it was disappointing, shocking, add whatever adjective you would like to this. If you're happy for Yuki, fantastic. And I am too, partially. I just think that Liam deserved more time at Red Bull. I think that he needed to have more time in order to get things going and in order to learn the car. There's lots of rumors out there as to why this change happened. Maybe it's to appease Honda. Maybe they genuinely believe that Yuki will extract more out of the performance of the car. Some are saying that they just wanted to preserve Liam's confidence, and they wanted to make sure that he was still ensured that not doing well in the Red Bull wasn't a detriment to his overall confidence. So who knows what the reasoning is? Either way it happened, and honestly, I am incredibly disappointed in Red Bull and the way that they've chosen to handle this. I think that Liam at least deserved, if they were going to do this, because Red Bull does do this, maybe 5 races, maybe 6 races. The big question mark going into the season was who's going to last longer at their respective teams, Jack Doohan or Liam Lawson. And everyone hedged their bets and was saying, yeah, Jack Doohan's got 5 races to impress Alpine or he's out. Go figure. Liam Lawson has now spent less time at Red Bull in hours than Max has wins, which is crazy to think about. Overall, I don't feel great about this. I think that it's really disappointing. I hope that Yuki does well at Red Bull. I hope that things perform and things go really well. But I also hope that he doesn't, for the reason of I want Red Bull to be like, yeah, you got to fix your car. And, you know, I don't want to quote Christian Horner word for word, but fix your car if it's broken. So that is my thoughts. All right, we're going to wrap up here with what we got. Before we go, let's take a look at the drivers' standings. As we can see here, we have Lando Norris in the lead. This is the first time he's led the championship over the last 2 races. And having a 8-point lead over Max doesn't seem gigantic, but it's pretty big gap. If Max were to finish first, which I seriously doubt that's going to happen, and Lando finished second, Lando would still be winning the championship or leading the championship. George Russell is performing really well, and the fact that we have second, third, and fourth separated by 1 point apiece is very exciting. Honestly, I don't foresee that staying. I foresee that Oscar will probably move up and will probably be chasing Lando. Kimi Antonelli, like we said, he's doing really well. This is his first season. He scored points on debut. He is scoring points in his second race, and he seems to be very consistent. Alex Albon in the Williams. I think this is the first time we've seen a Williams higher than 10th in the driver standings after a number of races. Esteban Ocon is doing really well in the Haas. He scored double points for Haas in China, which is very exciting. Lance Stroll. Now, I know most people don't like Lance Stroll, and I understand why. He makes very, very dumb decisions, and he's not very consistent in the car. Spatial awareness is almost out the window, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on for a while. But usually he does well at the beginning of the season. I think he's finished around 10th, 11th pretty consistently in the driver standings. Now, let's talk about this. Lewis Hamilton is ahead of Charles Leclerc, but both of them are 9th and 10th. Now, if you're unsure as to why this might be, the Chinese Grand Prix, both of them were disqualified for different reasons. Lewis was disqualified for having a shaved down plank. So there's a skid block underneath the cars. Now, the skid block can only be worn down so much before it can be disqualified. Now, Charles, he was disqualified for being underweight. There's a weight limit as to how heavy the car can be, and that is a combination of the car and the driver. If you're under that weight, it is said that you get a performance increase, which 1 kilo, it does make a bit of a difference. So that is why they were disqualified. There's only been 4 times, including this one, that 2 drivers from the same team have been disqualified for different reasons. And that's heartbreaking to hear, especially considering Ferrari can do better and Ferrari should be doing better. All right, that's my 2 cents. 2 cents on Ferrari. Okay, to wrap things up, let's go to the constructors. Now, shocker, surprise, surprise, McLaren is doing extremely well, as to be expected. Testing, they were doing amazing. The first 2 races, they've been doing amazing, even though Oscar had to do a bit of a recovery for the last few laps at McLaren in Australia, but he came back strong and they had a 1-2 in China. Once again, Mercedes is doing really well. with George and Kimi scoring big points and consistently scoring points. George has 2 podiums, and Kimi has finished at least 4th in Australia, and that's exciting to see. Red Bull Racing, that's the points there are max. That is just max. So if we could get a second driver, they may be a little more in the mix, but at the moment, I can't see Red Bull performing higher than where they are right now. Williams and Ferrari are currently tied on points. Now, for context, Williams finished, I believe, 7th, 8th last season. And the fact that they're 4th after 2 races is super exciting. And the fact that we are there tied with Ferrari is also very exciting. But I think Ferrari would be much higher up if they didn't have the DSQ for both Charles and Lewis last race. So in terms of overall performance, this is kind of where I expected Williams to be. Not ahead of Ferrari, but kind of at the front of the midfield. Okay, talking about the midfield, we have Haas with 14 points. Well, once again, they got double points in China, so that's been really exciting. Aston Martin's doing really well. Now, those 10 points, that is all Lance Stroll. So Lance Stroll is currently soloing the team at the moment. Kick Sauber has 6 points, and that is all Nico Hülkenberg. For context as well, Sauber finished last season with 4 points. So Nico Hülkenberg has outscored their entire 2024 season in the first race. Racing Bulls is 3rd, and then Alpine haven't scored yet. I don't know if this is representative of how good or bad the Alpines are or the rest of the midfield is. This is extremely tight, and this will change often, at least between 7th and 10th. I have a feeling that Alpine will probably be a little higher up. And honestly, if Sauber scores more points, I'll be surprised. So that is it. And that is all. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been fun. I've really been talking these guys' ears off for Formula One for a while now. So the fact that we get to come back and we get to talk about it a little more. We're going into a triple header over the next 3 weeks. We have China, then Bahrain, then Jeddah. Japan, Bahrain, and then Jeddah. So Japan is this weekend. It's going to be super exciting. Be sure to stay up late. I believe the race starts for us at 1 a.m. And I think it's going to be the last race that starts this late or that late in the evening, night, morning, whatever you say, at least until Vegas. Everything else should be relatively early in the morning or midday. So that is it from me. Thank you again for tuning in. My name is Evan Halbert, and this has been Off the Grid, only on rightradio.ca.